They had no idea that the man they were about to physically remove from the theater was the billionaire who owned every seat, every stage light, and every brick in the building. When Broadway legend Elias Vance sat down in his own VIP box 30 minutes before curtain, he triggered a chain of discrimination so shocking that it would end with him canceling a sold-out premiere and firing 2 senior managers in front of hundreds of witnesses. Watch as an arrogant house manager tears up the founder's personal invitation and calls him a criminal, as an artistic director threatens the very person who greenlit his career, and as security arrives to escort the theater owner from his own building. But this isn't just about one night's injustice. This is about how one man's strategic response to discrimination sparked a cultural revolution that transformed Broadway itself, exposed years of systematic bias, and created accountability measures now used by theaters nationwide. You're about to witness what happens when assumptions meet authority, when prejudice confronts power, and when true leadership turns a moment of humiliation into an industry-wide transformation. Stay until the end to see how this single evening changed not just careers, but the entire culture of American theater forever. They had no idea that the man they were about to humiliate and physically remove from the theater was the very person who had saved it from bankruptcy and owned every brick, every seat, and every spotlight in the building. Elias Vance adjusted his simple black turtleneck as he settled into the plush velvet chair of the founder's box, his eyes taking in the magnificent view of the Sovereign Opera House's golden stage. To anyone watching, he looked like just another theater patron who had somehow managed to secure premium seating. But the truth was far more extraordinary. 30 years ago, Elias had stood on that very stage as a young actor, his voice carrying Othello's anguished monologue to a nearly empty house. Despite his extraordinary talent and classical training from Juilliard, casting directors consistently offered him the same limiting roles: the angry young man, the dangerous outsider, the tragic victim. Never the romantic lead, never the hero whose story audiences were meant to follow and celebrate. The message was clear. His skin color would always define his possibilities more than his abilities ever could. So Elias made a decision that would reshape both his life and the American theater landscape. If the industry wouldn't let him tell the stories he was born to tell, he would create his own industry. He walked away from acting and dove headfirst into business, building an entertainment empire that started with a single off-Broadway production company and grew into a multimedia powerhouse worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But success hadn't dulled the memory of those early rejections, or the sting of watching less talented actors land roles he could have transformed into something transcendent. When the Sovereign Opera House faced bankruptcy 5 years ago, Elias saw an opportunity to put his money where his principles were. He quietly purchased the theater, not as a trophy or a vanity project, but as a temple to the idea that talent should be the only currency that mattered in the arts. The renovation had cost him $27 million, but every penny had been worth it to create a space where artists could flourish, regardless of the prejudices that had once limited his own dreams. He had insisted on keeping his ownership private, operating through a complex web of holding companies and trusts that allowed him to remain invisible while ensuring the theater operated according to his vision of artistic excellence and inclusion. Tonight was the premiere of Celestial Voices, a groundbreaking opera that featured the most diverse cast in the theater's century-long history. The lead soprano was a brilliant young black woman from Detroit. The tenor was a first-generation Mexican-American whose voice could make angels weep. The supporting cast represented a beautiful tapestry of backgrounds and experiences that reflected the true face of American artistry.
As Elias looked out over the rapidly filling theater, he felt a familiar mixture of pride and vigilance. He had created this space to be different, to be better, to be proof that excellence flourished when barriers were removed rather than reinforced. But creating policies was one thing. Ensuring they were lived and breathed by every employee was another challenge entirely. That's why he was here tonight, dressed down and unannounced, occupying the box that bore no nameplate but had been designed specifically for him. He wanted to experience the theater as his patrons did, to see if the values he had paid millions to instill had actually taken root in the day-to-day operations of his dream made manifest. The crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly, signaling that curtain time was approaching. In 30 minutes, the magic would begin, and hundreds of people would witness the kind of artistic collaboration that he had spent his career fighting to make possible. But first, he was about to discover whether the respect and inclusion he demanded from his stage extended to every corner of his theater. He was about to find out in the most dramatic way possible. If you believe that talent and dreams should never be limited by prejudice, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, that their artistry deserves to be celebrated, and that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is building something better. Subscribe, because you're about to witness what happens when assumptions collide with reality. And trust me, you don't want to miss what unfolds when respect meets disrespect in the most elegant venue in the city.
Right at that moment, as Elias savored the anticipation of the evening ahead, the ornate door to his private box burst open with the kind of theatrical authority that belonged on stage, not in the audience. Miss Isabelle Croft, the formidable house manager, swept into the space like a storm front, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to add inches to her already imposing height. Behind her followed Mr. Alistair Finch, the celebrated artistic director, whose reputation for brilliant productions was matched only by his legendary arrogance. Isabel's eyes locked on to Elias with the predatory focus of someone who had spent 15 years managing one of Broadway's most exclusive venues. In her mind, she had seen it all. Drunk patrons who stumbled into wrong boxes, celebrities who assumed their fame granted them access to any seat they desired, and most commonly, opportunistic theatergoers who tried to upgrade themselves to premium seating when they thought no one was looking. "Excuse me," Isabel's voice cut through the elegant ambiance of the box like a blade through silk. "This is a private box, and you most certainly do not belong here." Her tone carried the kind of absolute certainty that came from years of dealing with people who didn't understand their place in the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of high-end theater. Alistair stepped forward, his designer bow tie perfectly knotted and his expression radiating the kind of casual disdain that successful people often reserved for those they deemed beneath their notice. At 53, he had directed 17 Broadway productions and won 2 Tony Awards, achievements that had inflated his ego to theatrical proportions. "The Founder's Box is reserved for our most distinguished patrons and benefactors," he added, his British accent adding an extra layer of condescension to his words. "Certainly not for someone who appears to have wandered in from the street." The casual cruelty of the assumption hit Elias like a physical blow. Here he was, sitting in a box he had personally designed, in a theater he had saved from demolition, being told he didn't belong by employees whose salaries he ultimately paid. The irony was so complete it almost felt scripted, except that the pain of being judged by his appearance rather than his achievements was all too real and all too familiar. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Elias replied, his voice maintaining the kind of calm that came from years of learning to control his reactions to prejudice. "This is indeed where I'm supposed to be this evening." Isabel's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "A misunderstanding? The only misunderstanding here is your belief that you can talk your way into premium seating." Without warning, she reached toward the armrest where Elias had placed his silk-bound invitation, the kind of elegant, personalized invitation that only the theater's most important patrons received. What happened next would have been shocking if it weren't so predictably cruel. Isabelle snatched the invitation with the swift efficiency of someone confiscating contraband, examined it for exactly 2 seconds, and then tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo in the confined space of the box. "Forgeries are becoming quite sophisticated these days," she announced, dropping the torn pieces onto the plush carpet like discarded trash. "But the security team briefed me about potential gatecrashers trying to use fake invitations for tonight's premiere. The show is completely sold out, and we don't have room for trespassers who think they can just wander into a private box with a piece of paper they printed at home." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Not only had they assumed he didn't belong based on his appearance, but now they were accusing him of forgery and theft. The progression from suspicion to hostility to outright criminalization was happening with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time making such assumptions about people who didn't fit their narrow expectations. Alistair nodded approvingly at Isabelle's decisive action. "Quite right. We simply cannot allow this kind of behavior to disrupt our premiere. The reputation of the sovereign depends on maintaining the highest standards of exclusivity and security." Elias watched the torn pieces of his invitation flutter to the floor, each fragment representing not just paper and ink, but the casual destruction of his authority in his own space by people who couldn't imagine that competence, success, and ownership might come in a package that didn't match their preconceptions.
But what happened next would transform a private humiliation into a very public spectacle that hundreds of theater-goers would witness firsthand. Elias looked down at the torn fragments of his invitation scattered across the Persian carpet, each piece bearing the distinctive watermark and gold embossing that marked it as one of only 12 such invitations issued for tonight's premiere. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own signature was visible on one of the larger fragments. "I understand your concern about security," Elias said, his voice carrying the kind of measured calm that came from decades of navigating hostile corporate boardrooms. "However, I believe you'll find that this box is exactly where I'm supposed to be this evening. This is my personal box." The statement hung in the air with quiet authority, but Alistair Finch's response was immediate and cutting. He threw back his head and released a laugh so loud and derisive that it echoed beyond the confines of the box, carrying into the theater's main seating area, where early arriving patrons were settling into their seats. "Your personal box?" Alistair's voice dripped with mockery. "My dear fellow, do you have any idea where you are? This is the Sovereign Opera House, not some community theater where you can simply claim ownership of premium seating." His laughter continued, punctuated by theatrical gestures that seemed designed to draw even more attention to the confrontation. "The Founder's Box belongs to the theater's most distinguished benefactors, people who have contributed millions to preserve this cultural institution." What Alistair didn't realize was that his theatrical outburst was doing exactly what Elias would have hoped for if he had planned this confrontation. The commotion was drawing attention from across the theater, and in an age where everyone carried a camera, attention meant documentation. In the adjacent box, Mrs. Victoria Sterling, the theater critic for the New York Arts Review, had been reviewing her notes for the evening's performance when the raised voices caught her attention. As someone who had covered Broadway for 23 years, she recognized drama when she heard it, and she also recognized something far more troubling: the particular tone of condescension that often accompanied discrimination in elite cultural spaces. Victoria discreetly pulled out her phone and began recording, her journalist's instincts telling her that whatever was unfolding in the Founder's Box was going to be significant.
She had seen too many incidents of bias in supposedly enlightened cultural institutions to dismiss this as a simple misunderstanding. Across the theater, in another premium box, Dr. Marcus Webb, a prominent surgeon and longtime patron of the arts, noticed the disturbance and felt his own sense of unease growing. As one of the few black patrons in the theater's premium seating section, he was acutely aware of the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion that played out in spaces like this. He, too, began recording, understanding instinctively that documentation might be important for whatever was about to unfold.
In the orchestra section below, several patrons had turned in their seats to observe the commotion in the elevated boxes. The acoustic design of the theater, intended to carry voices from stage to audience, was now carrying the voices of conflict from box to theater, creating an unintended performance that was far more dramatic than anything scheduled for the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out a voice from one of the side boxes, "some of us are trying to enjoy the pre-show atmosphere. Perhaps this discussion could be conducted more quietly?" The comment drew murmurs of agreement from nearby sections, but it also ensured that even more eyes were now focused on the founder's box. Isabelle Croft's face flushed with embarrassment at the public attention, but rather than de-escalating the situation, she doubled down on her aggressive approach. "Sir, your persistence is becoming disruptive to our other patrons," she announced, her voice now deliberately projected to demonstrate her authority to anyone watching. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately, or I will be forced to call security." The threat of security being called sent a ripple of tension through the watching audience. This was no longer a private dispute between theater management and a patron. This was becoming a public spectacle that could define how the Sovereign Opera House treated people who didn't fit certain expectations. Elias remained perfectly still in his chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap. But those watching could see something shifting in his posture. The patience of a man who had endured similar treatment throughout his life was reaching its natural limits, and the growing audience of witnesses was about to see what happened when dignity met discrimination in one of the most prestigious cultural venues in the city. The torn invitation pieces on the floor seemed to mock the very values of respect and inclusion that the theater claimed to champion, and everyone present was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the evening's scheduled performance ended. No one expected what happened next to completely shift the balance of power in that opulent theater box. As the tension reached a crescendo and multiple patrons openly recorded the confrontation, Isabelle made a decision that would prove to be her final mistake of the evening. She pressed the small communication device clipped to her lapel and spoke with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question. "Leo, please report to the founder's box immediately. We need assistance with an unauthorized patron situation." Her voice carried the kind of professional detachment that suggested this was routine theater business rather than the character assassination it had become. Within moments, Leo Martinez appeared at the box entrance, slightly out of breath from hurrying up 3 flights of stairs. At 24, Leo was one of the theater's most dedicated ushers, a recent graduate from NYU's theater program who worked at the Sovereign while auditioning for roles throughout the city. He had taken this job because he believed in the theater's mission of artistic excellence and inclusion, values that had been repeatedly emphasized during his orientation and training. "Yes, Miss Croft?" Leo asked, his voice respectful, but tinged with uncertainty as he took in the scene before him. The torn invitation pieces on the floor, the hostile postures of Isabelle and Alistair, and, most importantly, the absolute calm radiating from the man they were confronting. "This gentleman has been attempting to occupy premium seating without proper authorization," Isabelle explained, her tone suggesting that Leo should immediately understand his role in resolving this situation.
We need you to escort him to more appropriate seating in the general admission area." But Leo hesitated. Something about the entire scenario felt wrong to him. In his 6 months working at the Sovereign, he had never seen a gatecrasher who responded to confrontation with such unshakable composure. Trespassers typically became defensive, argumentative, or tried to flee when challenged. This man showed none of those behaviors. Instead, he sat with the kind of quiet dignity that Leo had only observed in the theater's most distinguished patrons. More troubling was the growing attention from the audience. Leo could see phones pointed in their direction from multiple boxes, and the murmurs of concern were becoming audible even over the pre-show music. Whatever was happening here was becoming a public spectacle, and Leo's theater training had taught him that protecting the institution's reputation was paramount. "Sir," Leo said, addressing Elias directly rather than simply following Isabelle's directive, "could I perhaps see some form of identification or ticket stub to help us resolve this quickly and quietly?" The question was reasonable, professional, and gave everyone an opportunity to de-escalate. But Alistair's response revealed just how deeply his prejudices ran.
"Leo, you don't negotiate with trespassers," Alistair snapped. "Miss Croft has made the situation perfectly clear. This man has no business being in this box, and your job is to remove him, not to conduct some sort of diplomatic summit." That's when the audience decided to make their feelings known. From the adjacent box, a distinguished older gentleman in an elegant tuxedo called out clearly, "Excuse me, but let the man speak. We're trying to enjoy our evening, and this entire confrontation seems completely unnecessary." His comment was immediately supported by voices from other premium seating areas. "Yes, give him a chance to explain himself," called a woman from across the theater. "This is getting ridiculous," added another patron from the orchestra section. The tide of public opinion was shifting dramatically. What had started as a private confrontation between theater management and a supposed intruder was becoming a public referendum on fairness, dignity, and the basic courtesy that patrons expected from an institution they supported with their attendance and financial contributions. Leo found himself caught between his loyalty to his supervisors and his growing conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with how this situation was being handled. The man in the box hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made threats, and hadn't displayed any of the behaviors that would justify the aggressive treatment he was receiving. Meanwhile, the audience that kept the Sovereign Opera House financially viable was expressing clear disapproval of management's approach. "Ms. Croft," Leo said carefully, "perhaps we should contact the box office to verify seating arrangements before we proceed further. The patrons seemed concerned about how we're handling this." Isabelle's face reddened with anger at having her authority questioned by a junior employee in front of witnesses. "Leo, you will follow my instructions immediately, or you can consider your employment with this theater terminated." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. Leo realized that his next decision would define not just his own future, but his role in what was clearly becoming a defining moment for the Sovereign Opera House's commitment to the values it claimed to champion. If you've ever watched injustice unfold and felt the power of people standing up and saying, "This isn't right," hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who believes that dignity and respect should never be negotiable, no matter where you are or who you're dealing with. Subscribe because you're about to see what happens when assumptions meet reality in the most dramatic way possible. And trust me, you don't want to miss the moment when truth finally speaks louder than prejudice.
But instead of recognizing the mounting evidence that she was making a catastrophic mistake, Isabelle chose to escalate the situation beyond any reasonable point of return. The growing chorus of patron disapproval, Leo's obvious discomfort with the situation, and the multiple phones recording every word seemed only to harden her resolve. Perhaps it was professional pride refusing to admit error. Perhaps it was the intoxicating certainty that comes with unchecked authority. Or perhaps he was simply the kind of willful blindness that prevents people from seeing truth when it threatens their worldview. "Enough," Isabelle declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the increasingly agitated audience. "This has gone on far too long, and I will not have the reputation of this theater compromised by someone who thinks he can manipulate sympathetic patrons into supporting his deception." She turned to Leo with the kind of cold authority that brooked no further discussion. "Since you seem unable to handle this situation appropriately, I'm calling security myself." She reached for her radio again, but this time her intention was unmistakably more serious. "Security to the founder's box immediately. We have a trespasser who is refusing to leave and is now causing a significant disturbance. Please bring 2 officers prepared for a potential escort situation." The words "potential escort situation" sent a chill through the watching audience. This was no longer about seating arrangements or misplaced tickets. This was about the threatened physical removal of a man whose only crime appeared to be occupying a seat while failing to match someone's expectations of who belonged in premium theater seating. From the adjacent box, Victoria Sterling continued recording while simultaneously taking mental notes for what was clearly going to be a story that extended far beyond her usual theater reviews. In her 2 decades of covering Broadway, she had never witnessed such a blatant display of discrimination unfolding in real time, with multiple witnesses documenting every moment. Dr. Marcus Webb, watching from his own premium box, felt a familiar tightness in his chest. As a successful surgeon who had faced similar assumptions throughout his career, he recognized the particular combination of disbelief and resignation that seemed to settle over the man being targeted. But there was something else there too, something that suggested this story was far from over. Alistair moved closer to Elias, his posture deliberately intimidating as he prepared to support security's arrival. "I hope you understand that this situation could have been avoided if you had simply accepted our initial request to relocate," he said, his voice dripping with false reasonableness. "Now you've forced us to involve security, which is regrettable but entirely your responsibility." The victim blaming was so brazen that several patrons audibly gasped. The man had done nothing more than sit quietly in a theater box, respond calmly to increasingly hostile accusations, and maintain his dignity in the face of treatment that was becoming more shameful by the moment. That's when Elias finally moved. Not with anger or desperation, but with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. He glanced at his wrist, checking a vintage Patek Philippe watch that any true theater aficionado would recognize as the kind of timepiece owned by someone with serious wealth and impeccable taste.
The gesture was subtle but significant. In the theater world, timing was everything, and Elias was clearly very aware of time in a way that suggested this evening was unfolding according to a schedule that only he fully understood. 28 minutes to curtain, he said quietly, almost to himself, but his words carried clearly in the acoustically perfect box. Then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their deliberateness, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a sleek, obviously expensive phone. The audience held its collective breath as Elias speed-dialed a number with the familiarity of someone making a call he had made countless times before. The phone rang once, twice, and then a crisp, professional voice answered, clearly audible in the silence that had fallen over the nearby sections of the theater. "Good evening, Mr. Vance. Is everything proceeding smoothly for tonight's premiere?" The use of his name sent the first ripple of confusion through Isabelle and Alistair, but they were too committed to their assumptions to immediately grasp the significance of what they were hearing. "Celeste," Elias said, his voice carrying a new tone of authority that made everyone in the vicinity pay closer attention. "It's Elias. We have a code curtain situation at the Sovereign." Code curtain. The phrase meant nothing to the general audience, but Leo's face went pale as he recognized the terminology.
During his orientation, he had been briefed on various emergency protocols, including the rarely used code curtain, which granted the theater's ownership the authority to halt any performance due to serious operational or safety concerns. "Alert the board members," Elias continued, his words now carrying across the theater with crystal clarity. "And put the lead soprano on standby in her dressing room. Inform the entire cast and crew that tonight's show may not go on as scheduled." The effect was electric. The nearby audience members who had been following the confrontation suddenly understood they were witnessing something far more significant than a seating dispute. This wasn't just about one man's right to occupy a theater box. This was about someone who had the apparent authority to cancel a sold-out Broadway premiere, making a decision that would affect hundreds of patrons, dozens of performers, and the reputation of one of New York's most prestigious cultural institutions. Isabelle's confident expression began to crack as the implications of what she was hearing started to penetrate her certainty. Someone who could invoke emergency protocols and speak about alerting board members wasn't the random trespasser. Someone who had the lead soprano on standby wasn't making empty threats. Alistair's theatrical posturing faltered as he began to process the professional terminology and obvious familiarity with theater operations that Elias was displaying. The casual mention of cast and crew, the intimate knowledge of backstage protocols, the ability to reach someone named Celeste, who clearly held significant operational authority. None of this fit the profile of someone who had wandered in from the street. "Celeste," Elias said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of executive command. "I want a full documentation of tonight's incident for review by the board. And please ensure that our security team understands that the situation in the founder's box requires their immediate attention, not to remove an intruder, but to address a serious breach of our institutional values." The reversal was stunning. In the space of a single phone call, the power dynamics had shifted completely. The man they had been treating as a criminal was speaking with the authority of someone who clearly held significant influence over the very institution where they worked.
What happened next would become Broadway legend, talked about in theater circles for decades to come. The security officers Isabelle had summoned were approaching the box, their heavy footsteps audible in the corridor outside, when Elias made the decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for them to arrive and further escalate the humiliation, he chose to end the charade with the kind of theatrical precision that only someone who truly understood the power of dramatic timing could deliver. Elias ended his call with Celeste and slowly rose from his chair, his movements carrying the kind of natural authority that couldn't be faked or taught. He turned to face Isabelle and Alistair directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried across not just the box, but into the adjacent seating areas where dozens of patrons were now openly watching and recording. "Ms. Croft," he said, his tone shifting from the patient calm he had maintained throughout their confrontation to something far more commanding, "you just tore up an invitation bearing the founder's personal seal, an invitation that was signed by me, for me, to attend the premiere of an opera that I personally selected, financed, and approved for production." The words hit Isabelle like physical blows. Her face, which had been flushed with the confidence of someone exercising righteous authority, began to drain of color as the implications of what she was hearing started to penetrate her certainty. "Mr. Finch," Elias continued, turning his attention to the artistic director whose laughter had echoed so mockingly through the theater just minutes earlier, You're laughing at the man who personally greenlit your last 3 productions, who approved your current salary, and who is currently funding not just tonight's performance, but your entire season." Alistair's mouth fell open, his earlier theatrical posturing completely abandoned as he struggled to process what he was hearing. The casual confidence that had characterized his treatment of Elias evaporated, replaced by a growing horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his error. Furthermore, Elias said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades building and running successful enterprises, "I am the person who saved this theater from bankruptcy 5 years ago. I am the person whose financial backing allows you to work in this building, whose vision shaped the inclusive casting policies you've been systematically undermining, and whose commitment to artistic excellence you have just spent the last 30 minutes demonstrating you fundamentally do not understand." The revelation was devastating in its completeness. This wasn't just about mistaken identity or a simple misunderstanding. This was about 2 senior employees discovering that they had spent the evening humiliating, threatening, and attempting to physically remove the very person who owned the theater, paid their salaries, and had the absolute authority to determine their professional futures. Leo, who had been caught between loyalty and conscience throughout the confrontation, took an involuntary step backward as the full reality of the situation crashed over him. He had been asked to escort the theater's owner out of his own building. He had witnessed his supervisors tear up an invitation from the founder and accuse him of forgery. He had watched them threaten the man whose vision and financial investment made their jobs possible. The security officers arrived at that moment, appearing in the doorway of the box with the professional readiness of people prepared to handle a difficult situation. But instead of finding a trespasser to remove, they found their ultimate boss standing calmly in his own box while 2 of the theater's senior managers appeared to be in various stages of shock and disbelief.
"Officers," Elias said, acknowledging their presence with the kind of natural authority that made it immediately clear who was actually in charge. "Thank you for responding so quickly. However, the situation has evolved beyond what Miss Croft initially reported. I believe we now have a personnel matter that requires different handling." The lead security officer, who had worked at the Sovereign for over a decade, recognized Elias immediately despite his casual attire. "Mr. Vance," he said respectfully, "we received a call about an unauthorized person in your box. Should we escort these individuals out?" The irony was perfect and devastating. The very security team that Isabelle had called to remove Elias was now asking if they should remove her instead. Victoria Sterling, still recording from the adjacent box, found herself witnessing what was undoubtedly the most spectacular reversal of power she had ever seen in decades of covering theater and cultural institutions. The man who had been treated as a criminal was revealing himself to be the ultimate authority, while those who had wielded their power so confidently were discovering that their authority was entirely dependent on the goodwill of the person they had just systematically abused. Dr. Marcus Webb, watching from across the theater, felt a mixture of vindication and amazement. He had suspected something was wrong with the way the confrontation was unfolding, but even he hadn't anticipated that the quiet dignity he had observed was coming from someone with this level of authority and influence. The nearby audience members who had spoken up in Elias's defense were now realizing that their instinctive sense of justice had aligned them not just with the moral right, but with the person who literally owned the institution they were supporting with their patronage. "Miss Croft, Mr. Finch," Elias continued, his voice carrying the kind of finality that comes with absolute authority, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about whether your understanding of this institution's values aligns with your continued employment here. But first, I believe you owe explanations to the patrons who witnessed your behavior, the security team you summoned under false pretenses, and the young man whose job you threatened for showing more professional judgment than you demonstrated." Isabelle's hands were visibly shaking as she stared at the torn invitation pieces on the floor, each fragment now representing not just paper and ink, but evidence of her complete professional destruction. Alistair seemed frozen in place, his earlier theatrical confidence replaced by the deer-in-headlights expression of someone whose world had just been turned completely upside down. The security officers stood at attention, waiting for instructions from the man they recognized as their ultimate employer, while Leo struggled to process the fact that his moment of conscience had aligned him with the theater's owner against supervisors who had been willing to destroy his career to cover their own mistakes. The transformation was complete. In the space of a few minutes, victim had become authority, criminals had become employees facing termination, and witnesses had become the audience for the most dramatic reveal in Broadway history.
But what Elias did next proved why he had become one of the most respected and feared producers on Broadway. Instead of simply firing Isabelle and Alistair privately, instead of handling this as a quiet personnel matter that could be swept under the corporate rug, he chose to deliver justice with the same public visibility that had characterized their discrimination. If they were willing to humiliate him in front of hundreds of witnesses, then they would face the consequences with the same audience watching. Elias reached for his phone again, and this time his movements were deliberate and ceremonial. He raised the device slightly, ensuring that his voice would carry not just to those in the immediate vicinity, but throughout the acoustically perfect theater, where patrons in every section were now straining to hear what would happen next. "Celeste," he said, his voice cutting through the electric silence that had fallen over the theater, "please confirm my authority to halt tonight's performance under the emergency protocols we discussed." The response came through the phone speaker with crystal clarity, audible to everyone in the nearby boxes and many patrons in the orchestra section below. "Confirmed, Mr. Vance. As founder and majority owner, you have full executive authority to cancel any performance for operational, safety, or institutional integrity reasons. The board has been notified and supports your decision." The words hit the theater like a thunderbolt. Patrons who had paid hundreds of dollars for premium seats, who had planned their evening around this premiere, who had traveled from across the country to witness what was being billed as one of the season's most important productions, suddenly understood that they were about to witness something far more dramatic than any opera ever written. "Thank you, Celeste," Elias said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Please inform the cast, crew, and orchestra that tonight's premiere of Celestial Voices is canceled due to a serious breach of institutional values by senior management. Ensure that all personnel understand this decision comes directly from ownership and is not subject to appeal or reversal." The gasps from the audience were audible throughout the theater. This wasn't just about firing 2 employees. This was about a decision that would cost the theater hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, disappoint hundreds of patrons, and send shockwaves through the entire Broadway community. Isabelle finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Vance, surely this is an overreaction. We can discuss this privately, reach some kind of understanding. There's no need to cancel an entire production over a simple misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding seemed to echo through the theater, and Elias's response was swift and devastating. "Ms. Croft," he said, turning to face her directly, "there was no misunderstanding. You saw a black man in expensive seating and immediately assumed he didn't belong. You destroyed his invitation without examination. You accused him of forgery and criminal trespassing. You threatened him with physical removal. You ignored the concerns of patrons and the professional judgment of your own staff. This wasn't a mistake. This was a systematic display of discrimination that reveals fundamental problems with your fitness for leadership in an institution dedicated to celebrating human artistry regardless of the artist's background. Each accusation landed with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, and the audience of witnesses nodded in recognition of the behavior they had observed. Alistair, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his career, stepped forward with the kind of theatrical gesture that had once served him well in directing dramatic productions. "Mr. Vance, I deeply apologize for not recognizing you. If I had known who you were, this entire situation would have been handled completely differently." The apology was perhaps the worst thing he could have said, and Elias's response cut through the theater like a blade. "Mr. Finch, your apology perfectly illustrates why you are unfit to work in this theater. You're not apologizing for treating someone with disrespect and discrimination. You're apologizing for not recognizing that I had the power to punish you for it. You would have treated any other black man exactly the same way, and you see nothing wrong with that as long as your victims don't have the authority to hold you accountable." The distinction was devastating and illuminated the fundamental moral bankruptcy that had driven the entire confrontation. This wasn't about mistaken identity. This was about a pattern of behavior that revealed deep-seated prejudices and a complete lack of the values that the Sovereign Opera House claimed to champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias said, now addressing the entire theater, his voice carrying to every corner of the magnificent space, "I want to personally apologize to each of you for the disruption to your evening. You came here to witness artistic excellence, and instead you have been forced to witness the kind of discrimination that has no place in any institution, but especially not in one dedicated to celebrating the full spectrum of human creativity and achievement." The audience was riveted, understanding that they were witnessing not just a resolution of a confrontation, but a defining moment in the theater's history. "Tonight's premiere is canceled," Elias announced, with finality that brooked no discussion, "because I will not allow a performance to proceed in a venue where the management has just demonstrated that they do not understand or respect the values that make great art possible. Ms. Croft and Mr. Finch, your contracts with the Sovereign Opera House are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you are no longer welcome on these premises." The silence that followed was profound. In the space of 45 minutes, 2 successful careers had been destroyed, a major Broadway premiere had been canceled, and an entire theater full of witnesses had seen what happened when institutional discrimination met absolute accountability. Leo stood frozen, still processing the fact that his moment of conscience had aligned him with the theater's owner against supervisors who had been willing to destroy careers to protect their prejudices. The security officers moved forward, not to remove Elias as originally summoned, but to escort Isabelle and Alistair from the building that they had just discovered they no longer had any right to occupy. Victoria Sterling continued recording, knowing that she was documenting what would become one of the most significant stories in modern theater history, a moment when the cost of discrimination was measured not just in individual careers, but in institutional transformation.
But what happened next proved that true leadership isn't just about delivering justice, it's about transforming individual moments of accountability into lasting change that prevents future tragedies. As security escorted Isabelle and Alistair from the theater in a walk of shame witnessed by hundreds of patrons, Elias remained in his box, watching their departure with the kind of strategic patience that had built his entertainment empire. This wasn't the end of the story. This was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not just the Sovereign Opera House, but serve as a model for cultural institutions across the country. The theater buzzed with an energy unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. Patrons throughout the venue were processing what they had witnessed, many still recording and sharing on social media platforms that would carry the story far beyond Broadway. But Elias understood that viral moments meant nothing without systematic follow-through. Real change required more than public justice. It required institutional evolution. Moving to the front of his box, Elias addressed the assembled audience with the kind of commanding presence that had made him one of Broadway's most influential figures. His voice carried clearly throughout the theater, amplified not just by the excellent acoustics, but by the rapt attention of hundreds of people who understood they were witnessing history. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone carrying both authority and genuine humility, "what you witnessed tonight was unacceptable, inexcusable, and unfortunately not uncommon in cultural institutions that should be celebrating the full spectrum of human artistry. I want to personally apologize not just for the disruption to your evening, but for the fact that discrimination was allowed to flourish in an institution that I have dedicated my career to making inclusive and excellent." The crowd listened in complete silence, hanging on every word as Elias continued his unprecedented public address. "Tomorrow morning, I will be announcing a complete restructuring of the Sovereign's management and operational procedures. We will be implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, creating anonymous reporting systems for discrimination, and establishing a patron advocacy board that includes voices from every community we serve." His words carried the weight of concrete commitment, not just corporate platitudes. More importantly, we'll be creating a fund to support emerging artists from underrepresented backgrounds, ensuring that talent, not connections or assumptions, determines who gets the opportunity to grace our stage. The applause that erupted was thunderous, but Elias raised his hand to continue. "However, institutional change requires more than policy adjustments. It requires cultural courage from every person who witnesses injustice. Tonight, many of you spoke up when you saw something wrong. You refused to be bystanders to discrimination. That courage is what makes real change possible, and I want each of you to carry that courage beyond this theater into every space where respect and dignity are at stake." The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything the Sovereign had ever experienced. This wasn't applause for a performance, but recognition of a moment when words and actions aligned to create the possibility of genuine transformation. As the theater gradually emptied, with patrons still discussing what they had witnessed, Elias received a message from Celeste that would prove his instincts about systematic change were absolutely correct. An email had arrived in the new management inbox, sent from an anonymous address, but bearing the unmistakable details of someone with intimate knowledge of the Sovereign's operations. The email was from Marcus Rodriguez, a veteran member of the orchestra who had played violin with the Sovereign for 12 years. Marcus had witnessed tonight's events from the orchestra pit, and Elias's words about courage and speaking up had finally given him the strength to reveal what he had been documenting in silence for years.
"Mr. Vance," the email began, "watching you stand up to discrimination tonight made me realize I can no longer stay silent about what I've witnessed during my time at the Sovereign. Under Alistair Finch's direction, there has been a systematic pattern of discriminatory casting practices that have denied opportunities to artists of color despite their superior qualifications and audition performances. Marcus detailed incident after incident where talented performers had been passed over for roles that went to less qualified white actors. He provided dates, production names, and specific examples of Alistair's coded language when rejecting artists whose talent couldn't be questioned on merit alone. Most damaging of all, Marcus had been keeping meticulous records, including audio recordings of casting meetings where Alistair had made explicitly racist comments about the marketability of diverse performers. I have recordings, emails, and documentation spanning 3 years, Marcus continued. I kept these records because I hoped someday there would be leadership willing to address these issues. Tonight proved that day has come. I'm prepared to provide everything to support a full investigation into the discriminatory practices that have been poisoning our artistic community." The email represented exactly what Elias had hoped his public stand would accomplish, by demonstrating that accountability was possible, by showing that speaking truth to power could result in real consequences rather than professional suicide. He had created an environment where other victims felt safe to come forward. Within 48 hours, 7 more employees and former performers contacted the new management with their own documentation of discriminatory practices. What had started as one evening's confrontation was revealing a systematic pattern of exclusion that had been operating under the cover of artistic vision and commercial considerations. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. The documented evidence provided by Marcus and others revealed that Alistair's discrimination wasn't limited to the events of that evening, but represented years of systematically denying opportunities to performers of color while maintaining the public facade of institutional commitment to diversity.
The story exploded across theater publications, news outlets, and social media platforms, but the coverage focused not just on the discrimination that had been exposed, but on the systematic changes being implemented to prevent future incidents. The Sovereign became a case study in how institutions could confront their own failures and emerge stronger through accountability rather than defensiveness. 6 months later, the Sovereign Opera House reopened its doors with a new management team, a transformed organizational culture, and a cast diversity that reflected the true spectrum of American artistic talent. The premiere of Celestial Voices was rescheduled and became the most successful production in the theater's history, not just because of its artistic excellence, but because audiences understood they were supporting an institution that had proven its commitment to justice through action rather than rhetoric. Elias's decision to cancel that single performance rather than tolerate discrimination had cost the Sovereign hundreds of thousands of dollars in immediate revenue, but the long-term impact was extraordinary. Season subscriptions increased by 40% as audiences supported an institution that had demonstrated genuine commitment to its values. Donations from major benefactors reached record levels as the cultural community rallied behind leadership that prioritized principles over profits. Most importantly, the Sovereign became a model for cultural institutions across the country. Other theaters, opera houses, and performing arts centers began implementing similar accountability measures, understanding that Elias had proven that moral leadership was not just ethically required, but financially sustainable and artistically beneficial. Elias Martinez, the young usher whose conscience had aligned him with justice during that pivotal evening, was promoted to assistant house manager and became a key voice in developing the new policies that ensured every patron and employee was treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. The torn invitation that had seemed like such a devastating symbol of disrespect was now framed in Elias's office, not as a trophy of personal vindication, but as a reminder that individual moments of courage can create ripple effects that transform entire communities and industries.
If you believe that talent and respect should never be limited by assumptions, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to see that their voice matters. Subscribe for more stories about courage, confronting prejudice, and creating lasting change. Because sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is building something better for everyone who comes after you.